Hi. Okay, I am back and we are going to continue this reading of chapter 7. Now, I know that there's just a small clip that was about 5 minutes long. I had seen something and I was trying to get it put back in order, but it was too late. So, anyway, we had just read a leaflet that said about some coffins that had that were empty and had to be relocated after a flood. And now we're on the first page of chapter 7. And Evelyn was on her way home, but she was stopping at the hotel to see her brother-in-law, Steve. So let's continue reading. Evelyn stopped by the Tamarack Motel in Westport to visit with Steve one more time before heading back over Johnson's Pass to Oak Springs and home. They met in the parking lot outside Steve's room. Evelyn wanted to be outdoors in the sunshine. She had asked her parents and her son for a few private moments with Steve. "You look great," Steve said, and meant it. "I'm standing, I'm walking, I'm talking. That's got to be some improvement." Evelyn wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense, but Steve had always thought her very attractive. She was tall and strong, normally had a mischievous glint in her eyes, and tended to face life with a patiently assertive nature and a sense of humor that he had always admired. "So we know about me," she said. "How are you doing?" He knew she wouldn't accept any answer but an honest one. "I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm unsettled." "I still can't believe it," Evelyn said softly. "I can't believe Cliff's gone." Her eyes filled with tears. "I know," Steve said softly and put his arms around her. "I know." Evelyn leaned against him for a moment, feeling the comradeship of grief. Then she straightened. "I've still got to make the funeral arrangements, and the boys really need me right now." "I'll be glad to help any way I can," Steve said. Evelyn smiled. "Thanks. I really appreciate that, but you've done so much already." She nodded in the direction of her parents, who were standing by the camper talking quietly. "Mom and Dad will be helping me with what needs to be done, and I'm going to take a few weeks off from my job." Evelyn was a CPA with a firm in Oak Springs. "Tim Johnson, he's one of the partners, says he'll cover my accounts until I go back. He says I should take as much time as I need. They're a great bunch, just like family." "Sounds like a good group," Steve agreed. "I'm glad." Evelyn nodded. "So, as the saying goes, I'll just try to take it one day at a time," she smiled. "Or even one step at a time. I'm in God's hands. Nobody ever dies without someone questioning why. But, well, God has his ways, and we just have to trust him." Steve listened intently, deeply moved. Evelyn would rebuild her life. He had no doubts about that. He thought of Tracy Ellis's words. "You can walk away, Steve. You can put it all behind you." If only it were so. If only he could move on like Evelyn, not burdened with what he had seen, what he knew, what he still needed to know. For her sake, though, Steve kept his thoughts to himself. Then Evelyn asked Steve about his own plans. "Oh, I have a few matters to clear up here," he said vaguely, hoping she wouldn't ask him what they were. She didn't. Instead, she hugged him once more and said, "Steve, thanks again for everything. I'll call you about the memorial service." Tears filled Steve's eyes, and pulling back, he put his hand lightly on Evelyn's shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. "Take good care of yourself, okay?" "I will," she promised. "You too." Then she walked to the truck. Just before she climbed into the cab next to her son, Evelyn turned and gave him one last wave goodbye. Steve knew she had thanked him for killing the bear, for clearing up the whole question of Cliff's death. As far as he was concerned, her thanks were premature, and that pained him. Evelyn, Audrey, and Travis drove away in the truck and camper, and Albert followed. For them, Hyde Valley was history, a memory to be buried. For Steve, Hyde Valley was still the haunting, tormenting present. The phone call came soon afterward while Steve was studying the Forest Service maps of the area, planning his own private scouting mission on Wells Peak. To hear the phone ring perplexed him a little. As he reached for the receiver, he was going down the list of people who had the number and might call. The sheriff? Doubtful. That was over. Fish and game? Same answer. Evelyn? On the road. Dan Kramer? Steve hadn't gotten back to him yet. Tracy? Hello? Hello, Dr. Benson. Silver play. Now this he certainly didn't expect. What was that supposed to be, a French accent? It was poorly done, whatever it was. He answered smoothly, "This is Dr. Benson. Who is this?" "A friend, doctor." The voice was low, breathy, and creepy. "A friend who knows what really happened in Hyde River." "For real? A crank?" Steve was hungry for information in any case. "I'm listening." "I have heard you are leaving, that the case is closed." "That is bad, doctor. There are things you still need to know." "How far should I go with this guy? How far is safe?" "Well, let's see if you could tell me something I don't already know." The voice dropped to deliver the first gem. "Maggie Bly is dead." "Oh? Then you know of a body somewhere." No answer. "I know she's missing. Some people think she's dead. What I'm asking you is, if she's dead, what happened to her body?" The caller ignored the question. "She was having an affair with your brother." "I know that too." The voice was clearly disappointed. "Oh, you already know that?" "Well, how about we get back to the question you didn't answer? If Maggie Bly is dead, where is her body?" The voice hesitated, then tried. "You are a hunter, aye? You kill big game, you kill bears." "I'm a wildlife biologist. I study bears." "But you kill them. You killed the big grizzly who killed your brother." "That's what I'm told." "Then I will tell you." Silence. Where'd he go? "Hello? Are you there?" "Aye, I must tell you." It sounded very much like he did not want to tell Steve anything. Then he finally got it out. "There is a big creature in the mountains. A big creature ate Maggie Bly, and that is why her body will never be found. The creature ate your brother too." "Okay, here we go. What kind of creature?" Steve wanted to push a little, make the guy really say it. The voice was quite flustered. I cannot say, monsieur. It is not good to speak of it." "Are you talking about the dragon?" The voice stuttered, hemmed, and hawed. Finally, "I am sorry, monsieur. I cannot talk about that." You must look into it yourself. You see? Baloney. I've heard about the dragon just like I've heard about Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. I'm looking for some hard information about who killed my brother. If you can't give me that, but now the voice was sounding desperate. You must go after the dragon. You must kill it before it kills anyone else. Now this was a new tryst. You want me to kill the dragon for you? Aye, aye, Monsieur. So tell me where to find it. This guy sounded scared. I cannot talk about the dragon. Steve wanted to hang up on this jerk, but he said nothing and stayed on the line. What mattered at this point was that somebody was talking, somebody desperate. Monsieur, I'm still here. Do you know where Old Town is? Old Town? I never heard of it. Maggie Blythe was killed in Old Town in Hyde Hall. That sounded like real information. Maybe. Hyde Hall in Old Town? That is where Maggie went that night, and she was never seen again. Go there. This is where your search for the dragon begins. I will call again. I may not be at this number. There was a long silence, and then the man asked, You are leaving? No, I'll be around a while. Please call again sometime. But how will I know? Call me on my car phone. Here's the number. Steve gave the phony Frenchman the number, even as he doubted the wisdom of it. If you're sincere about this, you'll reach me sooner or later. Merci, monsieur. Good night. Au revoir. Click. Steve sat at the table a moment, reviewing the conversation. Tracy Ellis had said Maggie had gone back to Hyde River, but she hadn't mentioned anything about Old Town. He looked at the Forest Service map and found Hyde River easily enough, a helter-skelter cluster of little black squares in the narrow river valley. But where was Old Town? He couldn't find it on the map. Tracy Ellis would know, but bringing her in would bring in the whole sheriff's department, and they didn't want to pursue this thing any further. If anything, they'd stand in his way. So, okay, this was his investigation now. Pardon? Sorry. Levi Cobb. He'd been with Maggie toward the end, lived in Hyde River, and seemed willing, or at least able, to talk. He would be a logical first step. Steve knew he might get nothing but superstition and sermonizing, but somewhere in all that gospel soup there might be morsels of truth, something he could pursue. Hold on a moment. Mm. Um, I really don't get to talk to much of any of my friends anymore that I used to communicate with. Um, on occasion, I might hear like from Mark Ray Up or from Joyful Judy or Sensible Well-Being. But on the whole part, no, there really hasn't been too much interaction with the rest of the friends. So I miss everybody, though. I miss everybody. So let's see here. We have got Levi Cobb. There might be morsels of truth, something he could pursue, and what Levi would say. He started gathering up his clothes, his shaving kit, his hunting gear. He would check out of the Tamarack and get closer to Hyde River, plant himself deeper in the meandering gorge of Hyde Valley. He lived in the camper. He'd live in the camper if necessary, but he had to work himself into the fabric of the place, breathe it, smell it, get a feel for it. The truth was hiding up there somewhere, and it wasn't about to come to him. He'd have to stalk it, hunt it down. But what about the risk, the danger? His presence would not be appreciated. He thought of the superstitions, the oath, Cliff's body, Maggie's blood. We don't call 911. Well, he'd just have to be ready for anything. In a few trips, he loaded all his gear into the back of the camper. Then he climbed in and closed the door. He reached into the narrow clothes closet near the door and brought out a sturdy, foam-lined case, his .357 Magnum. He'd load it, and he'd wear it at all times. From a cabinet above the tiny sink, he grabbed his hunting knife in a sheath and strapped it on his belt. It, too, would be a part of him from now on. He jammed cartridges into the .30-07, then uncased his automatic shotgun and filled the magazine. He strapped the rifle into a rack above the front bunk. The shotgun he'd keep in the cab. The Dragon. Even as he was dropping cartridges into the .357, the thought skipped lightly through his mind. What if it's real? What if there's an undiscovered life form out there? What if? He strapped on the holster, dropped in the revolver, and snapped the holster shut. He was ready. Steve found Levi Cobb outside his garage, his head and shoulders inside the engine compartment of a monstrous articulated front loader, a huge yellow machine with 8-foot knobby tires, a deep loading bucket in front, and a hinge in the middle that enabled it to turn incredibly tight corners. And just a little info. My dad used to work at the cement plant, and he drove one of those articulated loaders. And they are huge. They're very huge. Levi had to use a small scaffold to reach the engine department. Steve could hear Levi talking, but there didn't seem to be anyone else around. You ought to see these plugs. I mean, if those county boys let them get this bad, you should say something. Mr. Cobb? Push this down just a little here. For some reason, I am too far. There. All right, that's a little better. Huh. Levi came out into the daylight, a wrench the size of his arm in his greasy hand. He took one look at the big, dark-haired man standing there with a hunting knife on one hip and a sidearm on the other, and then just sighed and leaned against the loader's 8-foot-high rear tire. I thought you'd left. His tone said he wished Steve had. Steve tried to relax. He didn't want this guy to feel threatened. Nope, I'm still here. Still hunting. He approached the loader. I was hoping you could help me. Not likely. Mr. Cobb, Steve lowered his voice. Is it true? Is Maggie Bly dead as well? Levi pulled a shop cloth from his rear pocket and started ripping the grease, wiping the grease off his wrench. I believe she is. There are some who say otherwise. Steve pressed it. How did she die, Mr. Cobb? Do you have any idea? I have my views. Did she die the same way as my brother? Levi's expression was troubled, but he didn't answer. Steve tried again. I really need to know. I've been told there's a creature who might have killed them both. If that's true, I'd like to go after it. Finally, Levi looked up from his rag and his wrench and down at Steve with narrowed, intense eyes. Mr. Benson, you're about 100 years too late. I think you just need to let your brother and Maggie rest and leave before somebody sees you talking to me. I only want information. My information you wouldn't believe anyway. Let me be the judge of that. Levi was clearly flustered and poked his head into the big machine as if to give himself time to think. When he finally spoke again, his voice was muffled inside the engine compartment. Well, I'll tell you one thing. All that iron you're carrying ain't gonna make you one bit safer. Steve came right back with, I'll have to be the judge of that as well. I have a job to do, Mr. Cobb, and I intend to finish it. Levi's head came out of the engine compartment, his bushy brows lowered over his eyes. Benson, the creature you're after you can't kill with guns. But you listen to me. You've got an attitude that'll kill you. You'll be dead before you even know you're in trouble, and I don't want to be a part of that. Steve looked away. Tracy had talked about Levi's sermonizing. He'd had fair warning. So Steve switched subjects. Then can you tell me how to get to Hyde Hall? Now that hit pay dirt. Levi stopped short and glared at him. Steve's tacky French tipster must have been right on the money. The big mechanic thought the question over for a significant amount of time, then sighed resignedly and slid down the huge tire to the ground. You can look, but you won't find anything. I could try. It's private property. I'll take responsibility for trespassing. His objections answered, Levi stooped down and scratched a map in the dirt with the wrench. Go north through town and right past the train of ore cars. The highway'll turn to dirt road and you'll see a grove of cottonwoods. Steve had no trouble following Levi's directions. He came to a little gravel turnoff, which Levi had described. He put the big camper into four-wheel drive and pushed through the gravel and high grass until he found a cubby hole behind some old firs in which to hide the camper. With the engine shut down and the door open, he could hear the sound of the river. He slipped into his camouflage jacket, slung the 30-06 over his shoulder, and locked up the camper. From there it was a short hike through tall grass and flood-killed snags to the bank of the Hyde River. The river, at its summer level, was wide and slow here, with extensive shores of smooth river rock. The air was just a little breezy right now, the applause of fluttering aspen leaves and the quiet sigh of the river the only sounds. Steve sank into the tall grass near a barkless, tangled tree and surveyed the river as far as he could see in either direction, carefully scanning the foliage on both shores for movement. He listened for sounds and took several deep breaths, sorting through the smells. He remained motionless. A familiar tension coursed through his body. It had been a long time since he'd felt this instinctive clue that there were two hunters in these woods, each hunting the other. Perhaps it was brought on by all the previous circumstances, but he went with it. He would not proceed until he knew if anything was out there and what it was. After several minutes, he inventoried some swallows swooping for bugs, an osprey patrolling the river for fish, and the usual flurry of insects. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was around here somewhere. With caution, his eyes making steady sweeps of the sound of the surrounding landscape, he set out along the shore, doubling back toward the town, walking on the smooth, flat rocks. He was in the open, so he did not feel safe, but he was able to cover a lot of ground quickly. Further down, the river narrowed and the current became swift and deep, splashing noisily in crystalline fans over the rocks and swirling in deep green pools. It was a beautiful sight that brought thoughts of rods, flies, and lures. There could be a nice big cutthroat right over there in that deep pool below the ripple. If Cliff were here right now, he'd be setting up his camera. Well, he could admire all that beauty some other time, perhaps. He kept going, hurrying over gravel spits and pushing his way through the tall shore grass. Then he saw a teetering structure of grain weathered boards obscured by willows and alders. He thought of what Levi had said. Old Town's just what it sounds like. An old town. It's the old Hyde River before the town moved. It's a ghost town now, and nobody goes in there. Just ahead, old pylons jutted out of the river, the remains of the wharf where the flat-bottomed boats used to tie up years ago. This was it, the once bustling mining town on the river, now silent and decaying. Steve reached the pilings and could imagine where the old road down to the river used to be. He moved inland, pushing through tangled berry thickets and grass, then climbed up a shallow bank. Then he came over the crest. He knew he'd arrived. When he came over the crest, he knew he'd arrived. Old Town. The ruins were a gray, decrepit scar upon the wild and beautiful setting, a dismal boneyard where progress had come to a halt and decay took it from there. He could make out the main street, mostly overgrown with grass, thistles, and service berries, flanked on either side with the ruins of the old buildings. Most were reduced to piles of weathered boards fallen all over each other like jackstraws. A few brick walls remained. The foundations were visible here and there, wherever the brush had not totally engulfed them. Some tall cottonwoods still stood in what may have been the town square, but for some reason the firs, hemlocks, and pines never got reestablished here, only the brush. Young aspens and cottonwoods had made a start in the remains of the buildings, reaching up through the floors and finding open sky where the roofs used to be. But even these trees looked weak and diseased. Steve sank to one knee in the grass and took some time to listen, look, and smell. Part of him kept pointing out how unnecessary all this caution was. It was the middle of the day, the place was quiet, and except for birds and bugs, it was deserted. But another part of him felt uneasy. These old ruins had a ghostly aura about them he could feel but couldn't explain. It was as if he had desecrated a graveyard or was treading on sacred ground. He didn't feel alone either. Yes, it was a deep primitive instinct, highly subjective, but he had learned to trust it. And yet the feeling had only gotten stronger the further he ventured into the place. All right, Hyde Hall. Where was it? Levi had said Hyde Hall was the second building from the river on the south side of the road and that it was directly across from the old Masonic, Masonic Lodge, which Steve would recognize by the remains of its front porch. Now he approached a large rectangular ruin, totally collapsed with its porch steps upended and rotting. This must be the lodge, Steve thought. He turned and studied the overgrown foundation and the three remaining walls across the street. This had once been a large structure, about 60 feet long, maybe 30 feet deep, with a massive stone fireplace at the center of the back wall. Hyde Hall, a meeting place perhaps, a dance hall or community hall. He approached slowly, carefully studying the ground. Someone had been here, that was easy to see. The grass was trampled and run over in several directions. The cops, most likely, scrambling to find out what had happened. In the middle of the street, he found a large patch of bare, rain-rutted ground. It was loose, dusty, and should have had footprints. Instead, it looked raked over, the surface brushed and smoothed out. Maybe the police had been combing through the soil looking for clues. He couldn't tell. He froze. There went that instinct again, warning him, seizing him by the guts and yanking for his attention. He stood still, his hand on the strap of his rifle. No sound, no smell. He was facing Hyde Hall, and the river was off to his left, barely visible below the brow of its bank. He slowly turned his head to the left, toward the river, the movement steady, smooth, robotic. His eyes looked in the surroundings in segments. He regarded the building next to Hyde Hall. No movement. The road? Only brush, grass, patches of bare ground from here to the river. Across the river? He eased his body around as the rifle came off his shoulder in a steady, fluid movement. Something over there didn't look right. Get down, his instinct screamed. With 3 long strides, he reached the cover of tall grass and dropped to the ground, his blood pulsing through his fingers as they tightly gripped his rifle. His eyes focused on a stretch of steep hillside across the river and a little upstream, a spot where the firs and pines were tall and thick. Danger, said his instinct. His stomach, twisting into knots, agreed. Beyond the opposite bank, where a meadow of deep grass ended and the forest began, the vertical lines in the scenery, the tree trunks, hanging limbs, tall grass, were breaking up, as if Steve were viewing the scene as a reflection in a cracked mirror. When there was no wind, the scene looked normal. But then a light breeze would stir the grass or make the trees sway, and the tree trunks would seemingly break in the middle as the tops swayed gently sideways and the lower portions remained steady. Something was over there, he could sense it. Another puff of wind bent the trees slightly. Again, their trunks appeared to break in the middle. Steve tightened his grip on the rifle. He thought he could see a shape, a curve, a barely discernible arc. Just like a hunter in a blind, he thought, hidden, camouflaged, watching me. His heart was pounding like a drum. Fear was setting in, and he began thinking defensively. How much distance between him and whatever it was? How fast would that thing move if it charged? How far would he have to run to find cover? Would he have time to fire a shot? With a quick, fluid motion, he chambered around and clicked off the safety. If only he could see what it was. If only he could pinpoint its position. Behind him, he heard the sounds of rustling brush, of swishing grass. In the silence, as tense as he was, the sound startled him as if it were thunder. He spun around and stood, raising the rifle to his shoulder. Up the street, 2 hands ran up. Between the raised hands, he saw a big cowboy hat, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, and a graying beard. Hold your fire! Levi Cobb. Steve exhaled as his body relaxed and the rifle came down. His hands and arms started shaking. Elk fever, they called it. The bodily reaction you sometimes got microseconds before or after a kill. Levi Cobb relaxed too, lowering his hands and coming forward again, moving methodically through the brush growing in the street. Didn't mean to sneak up on you. You're a little hard to see. You're pretty good. Steve looked across the river again. The mirage, if it was a mirage, was gone. The spell had been broken. There was nothing across the river but meadow and forest, although some trees were swaying as if something had passed through them. He turned to face Levi and slung the rifle over his shoulder. He didn't know whether to chew out this guy or thank him for coming, so he said nothing. Steve thought Levi seemed a bit disgruntled too. I don't know why I'm out here. I really don't, Levi said. He gave Steve another look over, his eyes going from the rifle to the knife to the sidearm, and then scanning the camouflage clothing. But I got a little nervous thinking about you trespassing around out here by yourself. Here by myself, Steve thought. Armed to the teeth, perhaps overarmed, in a strange place he knew nothing about. He could easily inventory Levi's weaponry. 0. Am I being foolish? He finally asked. The question tickled Levi and he smiled. Oh, not yet, I suppose. You haven't shot anybody, have you? Steve smiled back. Relief was beginning to set in, and it did feel good not to be alone. No, I haven't even seen anybody. Well, good enough. So let's get this taken care of so we can get out of here. He looked toward Hyde Hall. I see you found it. What do you want to know? Tell me about the other night when Maggie Bly disappeared. I didn't see much, but you know something. Levi nodded, then recounted the events in detail, from the phone call from Tracy to the quick conversation with shotgun-toting Harold, to the harrowing moments in Old Town. He pointed out the road he'd come down, making guesses as to which way Maggie had come, even recalling the songs she'd been singing. Then, in the middle of Hyde Hall's crumbling remains, he pointed out the spot where he had found the shoulder bag and the running shoe. And where was the blood? Steve asked. Right here, said Levi, waving his hand over a general area near a big flat stone, set like a monument in the center of the building remains. Steve noticed immediately that this area, like the dirt patch in the street, had been raked over. What is all this raking I keep seeing? Cover up, Levi said simply. People want to put this out of their minds as soon as they can, so they come out here and clean it all up, get rid of any signs. There seemed to be no limit to the outrageous habits of Hyde River. You mean somebody actually sanitized the area? Levi answered. Yep, with a little nod. Brushed away any footprints, any bloodstains? Levi nodded again. Who? Oh, Levi looked toward the river and thought it over. I don't want to put the blame on Harold Bly, but it might be some folks working for him. You never know. It depends on who gets killed out here and who wants to hide the fact. He looked at the raked ground, then surveyed the ruins. It worked with the others, but any more, I don't know. There are others? Were others? Steve stared at Levi. I don't follow you. Levi raised his hand to call a halt. Let's go back a bit. He looked around at the sagging walls and the big fireplace. You know where we're standing? You know anything about Hyde Hall? Nothing. Well, it was built by old Benjamin Hyde, the town's founder. It was a meeting hall for the mining company, and they rented it out for socials, dances, big dinners. I think there were church meetings here for a while, but that didn't last long. He gestured with his hands as he described the place. They had a bar downstairs during the early days and rooms upstairs so folks could stop in on their way up and down the river. Steve looked around at the size of the building, imagining how it must have been with windows, curtains, chandeliers, maybe a wide front porch with shady overhang and turned post. He could imagine a big log fire in the fireplace, dinner at the tables, drinks at the bar, laughter and chatter, and even the plinking of an old piano. It could have been that way. Or maybe he was just recalling scenes from the reruns of Gunsmoke. Pardon me a moment. They had some ladies for hire in the rooms upstairs and a few hangings from a tree out back. You see, this was the hub of the town. Everything happened here first. Levi sat on the big flat rock and removed his hat to stroke his brow. It was a wild town. People got real crazy, did crazy things. He faltered here, uncomfortable with the subject. In the late 1800s, things got so out of control that a bunch of people got killed and some others got run out. This part of town kind of went downhill from there. It started getting a reputation. Folks got superstitious about it. Now that was an odd thing to hear from a man given to so much superstition himself. I have noticed some superstition around here, Steve said, his tone ironic. Back then, Levi continued, this was the town of Hyde River. But over the last 100 years, the whole town's gradually moved downriver and left this place to rot. That's why they call it Old Town. Steve took it all in. The barren, silent loneliness of the place, the absolute and total abandonment of what seemed to be good on you, to be abandonment of what seemed to be good, usable real estate. Levi continued, now people won't come near it. They won't build on it. They won't drive, walk, or ride through it. And they sure won't come here at night. What are they afraid of? Oh, ghosts, spirits of the dead, all that stuff. They think the place is haunted. He looked down at the rock he was sitting on. Some say the devil lives here, and they talk about how this is the gateway where evil comes into the world. He paused just a moment, looked around the old ruins, and then said matter-of-factly, but most of all, they're afraid of the dragon. Steve thought. The dragon Tracy and the phony Frenchman had spoken about. But you're not afraid? Levi shook his head. That old lizard's got nothing on me. So what about the people who sanitize the area? Why aren't they afraid to be here? They're here on business. Helping hide the dragon, and I think helping Harold Bly hide whatever his interests are in the place. You won't see him here at night, though. None of them would ever come here alone, even in daylight. Now Steve hesitated. Was Levi superstitious, or wasn't he? Where did fact end and superstition begin in that gray head? So tell me about the dragon, Levi. What is it exactly? Levi's voice was suddenly very quiet. We better keep our voices down. We got company. Steve turned and looked down the road to the edge of Old Town and caught sight of two heads just ducking behind a ruin. Who are they? The guy with the white bandage around his head is Phil Garrett. He got his ear almost bit off in a fight, and the doctor had to stitch it back on. The other one may have been Carl Infeld. He looked kind of small. Carl Infeld. He was outside your place when Tracy Ellis and I were there. Yeah, probably. What do they want? Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Benson, but I think they were following me. Seems I can't go anywhere without Harold Bly knowing about it. There could be trouble now. This here is Harold Bly's land. Steve looked at him. What is? Most of all, most all of it. It used to belong to Benjamin Hyde, and Harold's a direct descendant. He inherited all this. Harold Bly owns Old Town and most of the New Town. Well, the mining company does. But Harold owns the mining company, so there it is. Levi looked in the direction where the two men had briefly appeared. They're gone now, probably gone back to report us being here. We'd better leave. He rose from the rock, and they started making the way out of Hyde Hall and into the street. Levi, Steve said in a hushed voice, I think you said others have been killed here. Did I hear you right? You did? How many? No one knows and no one tells, but it's been going on for 100 years. Oh boy, here was more legend and superstition. Steve hoped he could probe around all that and get to the heart of the matter. What about Harold Bly? Does he have anything to do with it? Levi rinsed. Harold likes to think he's the cause of it all, that he's in charge of everything, but it's the dragon's doing, really. It was time to humor the old guy, at least to get a few clues. So tell me about the dragon. They stopped in the middle of the street. If they left Old Town, they would have to go separate ways, which meant Steve wouldn't get an answer to his question. Steve was willing to remain long enough to hear it, but Levi looked around, obviously a little nervous. By now, Steve's curiosity was piqued. He prompted, I understand the dragon is a popular superstition around here. Levi looked at the ground and even scraped it around a little with his toe. No, not really. What do you mean? There's some superstitions about it, things that might be true and might not. He looked down the road again. So what is it really? Oh, Levi could have been describing a pet hunting dog. His tone was so calm and straightforward. It's a long, snaky, lizardy, flying creature. From what I can gather, back around the turn of the century, he wasn't all that big, but I guess now he's up to, maybe 40, 45 feet long if you could stretch him out, with razor sharp teeth and a mean streak that's worse now than it ever was. He's hungrier, too. But mind you, it's only a general description. Steve had to marvel at Levi's matter-of-fact acceptance of such a preposterous idea. Sorry. Are you kidding? You asked me about Maggie, said Levi. You were there, up in my bedroom. You heard Maggie talk about your brother getting eaten and her getting killed the same way, right? Yes, I did hear that. I thought she meant the bear. Levi shook his head. No, she knew it was the dragon, and that's why she came here. As part of the legend, the whole superstition. When it's your time, the dragon calls you here, and you come, and what? Well, those who believe in such things would say she came here. He pointed at Hyde Hall and went in the hall. Then the dragon dropped out of the sky, grabbed her, and carried her off to its cave and ate her. Levi could see he was losing his audience. Now that's what those who believe in such things would say. Steve sighed and tried to get the impatient, come on, get real look off his face. So that's the traditional view, the superstition. Levi nodded. Hyde Hall is the traditional place where people meet the dragon. I think the dragon can take a person anywhere he wants, but tradition says it happens here. So Maggie, in her guilt and her tormented state of mind, came here thinking she had to meet the dragon, that it was her time. If you don't show up when you're called, then the dragon comes after you or your family. That's part of the superstition, too. Then he added, but I don't believe that part. That's admirable, Steve thought. You're superstitious, but not that superstitious. Great. I was beginning to worry. Anyway, Levi concluded, I figured she'd come here to Hyde Hall, and that's how I found her shoulder bag and her shoe. And maybe you're making this whole miserable story, Steve thought. Maybe you know good and well what happened to Maggie Bly, and you're part of the cover-up. Levi, tell me something. Just why is it nobody else will talk about the dragon, but you don't have any trouble talking about it? Levi gave a little shrug. I'm saved, that's all. So with you, it's a religious thing. Levi crinkled his nose as he thought about it. It's kind of a religious thing with everybody. They've got their dragon. I've got Jesus. Simple. So, okay, Benson, what kind of theory can you build from all this? Steve looked around the ruins and tried to apply legend to reality. Levi, have there been several deaths recently? He shrugged. Depends on what you mean recently. Oh, how about the last year or so? This year we've had more than the last year. Well, two already, your brother and Maggie. Last year we probably had more than the year before that. And before that, well, nobody keeps records. Nobody talks and nobody asks, but every once in a while, some people just don't show up for breakfast the next morning, you know? Thinking about this troubled him. Seems like it's always been that way, but it's been stacking up, speeding up, just getting worse and worse. Used to be it was legend, it was talk, it was stories from way back told by the old timers. Now what we got? First your brother on Mills Peak and then Maggie and Hyde Hall in just a few days, and I got a feeling it'll get worse from here. But traditionally this is where they've always come to meet the dragon, right? Levi looked around at the sky. Oh, this would be a good spot, I suppose. The trees just never do well here, so the sky's open. The dragon could drop in here easy and grab somebody. Uh-huh. It was tougher grabbing your brother. Did you notice that? Steve was starting to lose patience. Levi, what are you talking about? The dragon had to crash through some trees trying to get at him. Had to break them right off. I don't think he prefers to do that. It's better here. Steve looked directly at Levi. He himself had noticed the trees the day he went to the site. How did you know about those broken trees? He asked slowly. I went up to Rails Peak and had a look. When? Oh, right after you and Tracy Ellis came to see Maggie. Levi could tell he was shaking Steve up. You did notice those trees. The tops broken off, the branches on the ground. Levi looked at the sky again. Yeah, it was tough there. Too many trees. Plus having a righteous woman there to contend with, getting in the way, fighting it off with a knife. Steve was beginning to feel uncomfortable with this man. Levi knew things, but he could weave myth and fact together so intricately, Steve couldn't be sure where one ended and the other began. What does Evelyn's being righteous have to do with it? Levi smiled at the thought. She survived, didn't she? I don't follow you. Levi didn't get a chance to answer. Just then, someone else shouted at them from the end of the old street. Hey! They both turned to see Deputy Tracy Ellis coming their way. Uh-oh, said Levi. We've been caught. Tracy was looking stern, like a mother about to drag her kids home by their ears. What's the problem here, anyway? Steve asked Levi. Harold Bly again, Levi whispered. This land has all the people scared, so he doesn't want people like us snooping around on him. Gentlemen, said Tracy Ellis, striding up to them completely in the role of deputy, just what do you think you're doing here? Checking out the side of Maggie's disappearance, Steve answered. Well, this is private property, and I've got a complaint from the owner. Levi, you are to know better. Just trying to keep this man alive, Levi said. Well, so am I, she snapped back. Now you've got 1 minute to vacate the premises or face arrest. She was sure talking loudly, Steve thought, almost as if she was performing for somebody. Levi took one last careful look at her, then walked up the street, heading back the way he had come. Tracy stood where she was and let her voice drop to tell Steve, let him get ahead. I don't want you talking to him. That was pushing it. Does your authority extend as far as telling people who they could talk to? Today it does. People are watching us. So we noticed. Are they the ones who called you? They told Harold, and he called the sheriff. I was just a few miles up the road, and he knew it, so I had to show up. Come on, let's walk. My camper's the other way. Maybe I'll impound it. They'll keep you out of trouble. They started up the street, well behind Levi. He was gone before they'd come to the edge of O-Town. So what's the game here? Steve asked. Are you arresting me or what? She was irritated and angry, and it was no act. Steve, I told you if you made trouble or broke the law, I'd have to do my job. Well, I wasn't kidding. You're trespassing, and Harold Bly has a legitimate complaint. I'm just trying to do my job. You don't have a job, Steve. Collins called it crits, remember? You're not authorized to be here, and if you come snooping around O-Town by yourself, you're going to have the whole town down your neck. Hyde Hall is off limits. It's sacred, taboo, okay? He stopped, indignant. Why? She grabbed his arm and gave him an authoritarian push. Keep walking. He kept walking. It's a long story. My prime concern right now is that you're getting people upset, which means they're going to be on my back, which means I have to be on yours. Then she added, and especially if they see you with Levi. They don't like him, Steve. Well, at least he'll talk to me. Oh, he'll talk all right. He loves to preach. He wasn't preaching, Steve said, pushing his way through the tall brush. He was telling me about the dragon. She pushed a gnarled branch aside so she could pass. For Levi, it's the same thing. They reached the edge of the ruins and started down the unused road toward the highway. So where does Harold Bly stand on all this dragon stuff? Tracy made sure her voice was quite low as she answered. If people are afraid of the dragon, that's fine with him. Especially when his adulterous wife vanishes. Especially. Steve was tossing a new theory around in his mind. Levi said that people come here to die, to meet the dragon. She almost stopped walking at that one. Steve, don't believe anything Levi says. His head is full of that kind of garbage. But what if? Now that he was about to voice his theory, it seemed a little silly. Maybe he had given Levi too much credence. Just what if a predator of some kind was responsible? At that, she did stop. Do dragons need firewood? Excuse me? Tracy hesitated, then admitted, I just came back from Rails Peak. The area's been sanitized, raked out, cleaned up. And those broken trees we saw, they're all cut up into cordwood, bucked up and stacked right there. She was incredulous. A stack of cordwood with absolutely no way to haul it out of there. Steve was stunned. Levi told me about those trees. He knew about them. Now she was interested, even if it was Levi. What'd he say? Steve chuckled a bit. He suggested the dragon broke them off while attacking my brother. Tracy allowed herself a small laugh. Well, there you are. Another cover-up, I guess, to do the dragon a favor. She shook her head in amazement. I can't believe how idiotic this dragon thing could get. And I grew up here. This place was raked out too. I'm not surprised. I'm sure it's all for the same reason. It's like I said, if someone wanted to pull off a murder, Hyde Valley has some old traditions tailor-made for the purpose. Steve paused to think something through one more time, then asked, so what did break the trees off? The people who killed your brother know the dragon legends. Trees broken off by the dragon would really sell in Hyde River. It would be very persuasive. But Steve still had a problem with it. How did they break the trees off? You're talking about snapping off an 8-inch trunk and several branches without a machine. She smiled knowingly. Hey, this is logging country. Get some chains, some cable, a few come-alongs, and some climbing spikes. The right people with the right tools could do it. So now we've got people defeating their own purpose. They break the trees off to stage a dragon attack, then cut the trees up to keep people from suspecting it was the dragon. She shook her head. It's Hyde River, Steve. One thing follows another. Steve gave her a teasing smile. But you're still looking, aren't you? You didn't have to go back to Rails Peak, not with Collins closing the case. What were you doing there? Tracy shrugged off the question and said, let's get out of here. I still have to lecture you and take you back to your camper. They walked on. Oh, and one more thing. Let me know if you get any weird phone calls. Alrighty, so there we have it. That is the end of chapter 7, and it is about to really get energized, if you want to use the word. There is, well, let's just say Steve ends up finding out a little bit more than he was prepared for. And, well, just going to have to stay tuned and find out what else. But, yep, it's really starting to get fired up. There has been a stirring of the bees. And, well, you know what happens when you stir up bees. You could get stung. Anyway, stay tuned for the reading of chapter 8 tomorrow and find out what happens next. I hope that you all are enjoying the reading of the oath, and that if there's anything that you'd like to ask, maybe some tie-in questions or whatever, go on ahead and leave it in the comments section below. I am enjoying reading this book to you, and